cities and how they might contribute to the whole sustainability agenda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, what are the challenges that we're trying to address and what's our idea around smart cities. And then going to talk a little bit about the data that we generate, and then some of the challenges that these smart city platforms face in terms of their own sustainability and keeping them going. And then I'm going to finish off with a couple of examples and use cases of where we've used this data to support policy and support changes in the city, to illustrate how smart cities can support the whole sustainability agenda. Now, if you think about cities, the way I think about cities is I think about these cities as systems all piled on top of each other. So we have social systems, we have political systems, we have economic systems, we have infrastructure systems, so our gas networks and our electricity networks and our comms networks, and transport systems, and then the natural environment. And these all collide in cities. And we think of cities as these systems of systems. And what we've been trying to do in Newcastle is perhaps a good example is to think of this as the MRI scanner for cities. So take a very, very detailed cross-sectional view through the city to try and understand these complex interactions. If you think of cities as complex systems, one of the artifacts and the properties of complex systems is that we often get unintended consequences out of complex systems. And what we want to try and capture through what we've been doing in Newcastle is some of those unintended consequences of our interventions into cities. Now, if you Google smart city, there isn't a city that isn't smart. Newcastle was Smart City of the Year last year in 2019, and Sunderland is Smart City of the Year in 2021. So we've kept it in the northeast. But every city proclaims to be smart. So just thought it was worth talking about what I mean by a smart city here. And that doesn't mean that the other definitions of smart cities are wrong or even incorrect. There are many different views of smart cities. So three of the most common ways we describe a smart city is one around the digitalisation of services. So putting services on the web, opening up services through local government and places like that. The second definition of smart cities often coalesces around the idea of ubiquitous communication. So 5G, 4G, Wi-Fi, everything connected. And the third definition of smart cities is often around these new types and sources of data. And that's the one I'm going to focus on today, because that's what we've been doing in Newcastle and some other cities in the UK, is thinking about how do we develop a smart city using these new types of data and what purposes can we put them to, and to do that at scale. So to move beyond the pilot phase where you've got a few instruments and actually try and do it at the scale of a city, because that generates its own challenges as well. I really like this quote, and I use it pretty much on every single presentation that I do. And it's from a US planner called Jane Jacobs in her book, The Death and Life of the Great American Cities. She talks about cities as being an immense laboratory of trial and error, failure and success. And what we've been trying to do here in Newcastle around the whole smart city agenda is to think about the city as a place where we can do experiments. If you think about it, we're doing experiments in the city all the time because we're redesigning bits of the infrastructure. We're building new roads, we're closing roads, we're putting in new railway stations. We're changing planning policy. All of these things are experiments that are going on. Now, you probably know from your own science experiments that there's a way we should do experiments. And the way we should do experiments is very simple. We should observe carefully beforehand. And then we intervene somehow. We do something. We close a road. And then we watch what the impact of that is and watch very carefully. And from that, we can produce some hypotheses as to what's going on underneath. And that, as you'll well know, that's the scientific method. So what we've been trying to do in Newcastle and other cities is how do we use cities as experimental platforms where we can actually carry out that scientific method, observe carefully, intervene, and observe afterwards to understand the consequences of our intervention. In cities in the UK and most other cities, an awful lot of effort goes into planning. So getting through planning is the big hurdle. When you're building a new building or you're putting in a new railway, whatever you're doing, it's getting through planning that's the hurdle. Once you've got it through planning and planning's been approved, there isn't a huge amount to be gained from actually working out whether it worked, whether what we did was actually beneficial. And there's certainly no capital in doing it constantly and checking again to see if it still continues to work. Many of you will have driven up and down the A1, and the A1, the main north motorway into Newcastle from the south, was recently widened from 2 lanes to 3 lanes around the metro centre. And at first, that improved travel times and it improved movement. But over time, what's happened as more and more people have used that road, and essentially now the travel times on the A1 are exactly the same as they were when it was 2 lanes. So we need to understand the impacts of our intervention and gather the data to be able to say, is something successful and does it remain successful? And that's really important when we come to challenging the big problems that face us. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what we've been doing in Newcastle. What we've been doing is spending lots of taxpayers' money, which is always good, to try and work out how to build a smart city at scale. So we've invested an awful lot of money in sensoring the city. We're using the concept of the Internet of Things, so sensors attached to lampposts and other things that gather information and constantly transmit that data back to the center. And all of this we publish openly in real time. So currently, I mean, there's actually quite a lot more than that now, but somewhere between 6 and 10 billion observations from the city. Every minute of every day, of every week, of every year, we get 10,000 plus new observations streaming in. And these are observations across many, many different sectors. So we're not just interested in transport, we're not just interested in climate, we're interested in it all and trying to so we've also got, as well as the observations, we also make extensive use of the CCTV network in and around Newcastle. There are about 260 traffic cameras that we use, plus another 20 in the city centre. And we collate all of those images and use those as a resource, and I'll show you some examples of those. So lots and lots of investment in data to answer 2 things. One about the trying to understand how you do it. How do you actually build a smart city? What can you measure? How good are the measurements? How many sensors do you need to understand a particular phenomena? But also to start to answer some of the challenges that our cities face. Things like air quality and climate change, those sorts of big questions, and how can we use this data to answer those sorts of questions? So what sort of smart city data do we have then? So there's lots of new data being generated in cities, some of it through just that data revolution that everyone's now collecting data. There's things like smart parking. So there's a smart parking trial on Newcastle Helix. We've also got a number of, most of the car parks in Newcastle have sensors on them that are either like this example here, which is using CCTV and machine learning to count spaces in cars, or they're in-out counters. So there's an example of data that's being collected. It's being collected for a particular purpose. And the purpose here is to manage the car parks and to enable people to find a parking space and all of that. But actually, it's a really interesting resource that we can reuse. And that's a theme we come back to, that we collect a lot of data operationally, which we can reuse to understand the city. We also collect information from CCTV video and CCTV stills, and we do lots of counting. So in this video here, we're counting pedestrians. So we count heads as they cross the blue lines. When they completely cross the blue lines, we count that as one head. And we can do this in multiple directions. So we've been able to tell Newcastle City Council, for instance, about whether their arrows have been working on Northumberland Street. And in fact, they have to a large degree in segregating people under COVID-19. The same camera can be used to measure lots of things. So one camera will be used to measure pedestrians, but also vehicles, as you can see here, so we can count buses. What we do with that data is we don't do any facial recognition, we don't do any tracking. All we're interested in is in aggregates. So we count for 5 minutes, and then what we send back is the number of how many people have walked past that, how many cars have gone past in those 5 minutes. So it's just aggregates of those. So there's no personal information being stored. And nobody's looking at these. This is machine learning and artificial intelligence that is scanning these images and doing these counts automatically without any human intervention. Anyone who thinks that machine learning is going to take over the world only needs to look at the fact that David Beckham here on the left-hand side is constantly being picked up as a face. But we never count him because he never manages to cross those blue lines. He's always there, but he's never counted. Some of the other data sources that cities create can be used to understand large-scale movement patterns. So we collect data, again, counts, using automatic number plate recognition cameras. Again, these are cameras that are deployed by the city and the local authority to understand and manage traffic flows in the city. And we get counts of those across the whole network. And so that scale of data enables you to think about what would happen if we close roads and where would that go. And we use that to start forecasting and simulating how cities operate. Another great source of data that we use is from public transport. Most of our public transport now have real-time data, and so they have GPS, sat-nav on board, and that data is being transmitted. In fact, in the next few months, a bill has gone through Parliament that opens up all of this data. So bus companies and others will have to release some of this data. They already release it to us. So we get data every few seconds. We get the position of all of the buses in the network. And that's actually a fantastic resource. Going back to experiments, what you want to do with experiments is you want to repeat your experiments, because perhaps it was a one-off. And buses are a brilliant experimental tool, because They constantly do the same routes, and they do it again and again each day, and they repeat it the next day. So we have repeated experiments. So after there's been an intervention, whether that's an accident or a road closure or whatever it is, we can look at the data and understand things like journey times, how long it took the bus to get through there, and put a number against the impact of that particular intervention. So they're a really great tool for carrying out experiments in cities because they repeat. We measure a lot of things in the environment. Newcastle has the largest and densest network of air quality monitoring anywhere in the city. This is a video where we've combined nitrogen dioxide readings, which is the green line at the bottom, with car counting on the Tyne Bridge. There's a bunch of sensors at the end of the Tyne Bridge. And as you can see, and no surprise, air quality is related to traffic volumes. Traffic is one of the large contributors to poor air quality. So we measure a lot of these, and we continue to measure this as Newcastle is going to implement a congestion charge to try and reduce NO2 and other pollutants in the city. So we'll have to understand the impact of that intervention and whether it works, whether it does actually improve air quality, or whether it displaces or moves that problem somewhere else. Some other types of data you may be less familiar with. So we have a network of noise sensors in and around the city. It's a couple of years ago now, but the peaks on the graph here were from Ed Sheeran's concert at St. James's Park in June 2018, I think it was. So this was him getting loud and leery on consecutive nights across St. James's Park. So we have a network of noise sensors around the city. Noise is quite interesting because it's relatively easy to measure. Things like air quality are very hard to measure accurately, whereas noise is pretty easy to measure. So part of the work that we've been trying to do is think about things that are easy to measure, because there's obviously a relationship between noise and traffic, and there's a relationship between traffic and air quality. So although we might not be able to measure air quality everywhere, we could foreseeably measure noise everywhere because it's cheap and easy to measure. And if we understand the relationships properly, hey presto, we can understand those correlations and use one sensor to measure something else. We also have trying to think across the piece, not just about the normal things, but also thinking of cities as part of the natural ecosystem. So we have a network of water quality sensors and flow sensors in and around our urban rivers. Next time you're on the quayside in Newcastle, you might spot this yellow buoy floating around. So this is a sediment buoy, and it's continuously measuring the quality of the water, the amount of sediment that's in the water, and various other things. And we also try and measure, and you can start to measure some really weird stuff. So we were thinking about, how do you measure something like ecosystem health? How do you measure greenness in a city, for instance? How would you measure that sort of thing? So we've been experimenting with things like putting sensors in beehives around the city to try and understand the impact of things like green infrastructure, where we use natural systems to manage our cities rather than just building things out of concrete. And can we measure that with sensors and get some data on those? So it's not always about hard engineering. It's often about some of these greener and more sustainable aspects as well. It's certainly quite hard to measure beehives, though. What we normally measure is when the beekeepers come and plonk 2 pounds of sugar in the beehives. So we suddenly see a huge spike in the weight of the beehive, and that's the intervention of the human beekeeper to keep their bees healthy. So there are some of the things that we've been measuring in the city, and this is a video of Newcastle Quayside a couple of years ago in August. There was a big supercell, rained very heavily, drains overflowed. And it impacted multiple systems. So it closed roads, it caused electricity outages and those types of things. What these problems that cities face, things like adapting to climate change, net zero, these types of things, these are examples of what we call wicked problems. And wicked problems are identified because there's no easy solution. There's no easy solution to climate change. There's no easy solution to carbon net zero. There's no easy solution to air quality. In order to have an impact on something like climate or carbon, we're going to have to make really, really hard decisions. And really hard decisions means that somebody somewhere loses. It costs them more money or it takes them more time. We can't always, you can't please everybody all of the time. And these wicked problems means that someone's going to have to lose. Now, if I'm going to lose, if it's going to cost me more money to do something, or it's going to inconvenience me because it's going to take me twice as long to get into Newcastle to go to work or to go shopping, whatever it is. If that's going to happen, I want to know it's been effective. I want to know it worked. And I think that is one of the reasons why we need smart city data and how it can improve the sustainability argument. Because knowing something puts you in a stronger position than not knowing something, even if it's incomplete evidence or it's not perfect data. It will be better than no data at all. So I don't want you to get the impression that the job done, you put a load of sensors out there and somehow you have a perfect system for understanding the city. There are many, many, many challenges in doing this and doing it properly. And we're only partway along the journey. When you read some of the stuff about smart cities on the web and other places, there is an almost understanding that somehow you wave a magic wand and you've got perfect data. That's far from it. Just as an example, this is Newcastle. These are the air quality sensors in Newcastle. We've got several hundred of them. But Newcastle, this is the Newcastle city area. Newcastle's quite big, so you can't measure everywhere. Data is sparse, even though we have billions of observations and have spent millions of pounds collecting all of this data. Data is sparse and cities are vast. So data is only part of the question, and it's certainly only part of the answer. We also need to take that data and build models and use that data to improve models as we move forward. And these things are far from plug and play. You need to maintain your network, and that costs money. This is Richard, one of our technicians, fixing an air quality gateway on the traffic lights. And you also need the cooperation of lots and lots of different stakeholders to do this in the city. We don't own the traffic lights, someone else owns the traffic lights, but we use them to put our equipment on them and we take some power from them. That requires us to negotiate with lots of different groups in the city. Cities are really complex places in terms of how they're organized and managed. So just maintaining a network of thousands of sensors has a significant cost in manpower and pounds in order to keep this up and running. We also have the problem about the quality of the data that we're collecting. This is still an area in its infancy. Internet of Things and environmental sensing is quite new. So some of the data we get out, we have to spend a lot of time calibrating it and understanding it and trying to work things out, and whether the data we're getting is good enough to answer the questions. So just because you can put a sensor out and it gives you data doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good data. Doesn't necessarily mean it's worthless, because we can start thinking about things like ensembles of data. So using the idea of the wisdom of the crowd. So you have lots and lots of data. It doesn't matter if some of your sensors aren't working, because you can apply statistical techniques to them. Even basic communications in cities. When you're walking around the city, you think, oh, your phone's always on. But if you have lots of sensors continuously in the same place talking across the 4G network, you soon realize that even in a city in the first world like Newcastle, there are significant comms outages during the day when the network doesn't work, or there's no 4G signal for half an hour. So this idea that we've got an always on connected city is not quite true. The other thing that we've come to learn is that everybody expresses a desire for data, but they don't really mean it. What they really want is they want analytics. So they want insight and analytics from that data, and that's much harder than data. So this is some work we did early on in the COVID response to look at, could we measure social distancing using our CCTV network? And it's quite easy to measure distances if you know what you're doing with image analytics. But insight and analysis of that is much harder, because you've got to take into account false positives. Should two people be working together? If they're part of a family, then that's fine. So the data itself is straightforward. The analysis is much more complex. And what we find is that people want analysis, not data, and that's quite hard to do. And that's where the future generation of geographers comes in. Where I think smart cities should be going, once we've solved some of these problems about data collection, and now we have some of these large networks of environmental monitoring like we have in Newcastle, is towards using that data as an asset towards simulation and forecasting. Simulation of, we can build better models because we have better data, and we can also validate those models because we've got measurements coming from the city itself. So we can use models and simulations to support decision makers. Perhaps even we can make different types of decisions in a city. When we make decisions in the city at the moment, they tend to take years. So any big decision in the city will take years to actually come to fruition. And then once it's made, it's set in stone. So in the near future, there's going to be a congestion charge in Newcastle for taxis and buses, and they're going to have to pay a charge every time they come in. But you can imagine a city where, because we've got constant data and we can forecast data, then we can actually perhaps have an adaptive pricing model for coming into the city. If the air quality is good, then we don't have a problem and you can drive your car in. If the air quality is bad, it costs you more. Perhaps we could go even further, and if the air quality is bad, we could incentivize you to come in a different way by reducing the prices on buses and trains and the metro, so you don't bring your car in. But all of that requires very high resolution data and models to be able to make these new types of decisions in cities. And a lot of people get freaked out by data that's collected, and quite rightly we need to address things like privacy. We also need to think about who owns that data and who manages and curates that data. The big tech companies, Google and Intel and Cisco and Siemens, these massive multinationals, are all interested in the smart city space. And they're interested in it because they want to monetize that data that cities generate. So we need to be really careful that if we don't do this, others will do it and then charge the cities themselves that generate the data for the analysis of that, or even the raw data itself. The flip side of that is we need to be really careful that we don't just measure the easy stuff. So I think it's really important that we measure things like pedestrian movements, because we've been measuring cars in cities for 50 years. And that's why we have a motorway running through the centre of Newcastle. Cars are easy to count, and we've been doing it for years and years. And nobody's worried about privacy around cars, despite the fact there are more number plate cameras than there are CCTV cameras in the city. If we only measure the easy stuff, we end up ignoring the things that are important about how nice a city is to live in, how easy it is to walk around. So I think we have to measure the hard stuff, despite some of these privacy concerns. We have to do it in such a way that we do it in a way that respects people's privacy. We also have to understand the limits of our understanding out of data. So data tells us some stuff about what's going on in the city. It tells us something's happening, and sometimes it tells us the magnitude of that. So when we have a flooding event, we can see the rainfall, we can see the buses slow down and the journey times increase. And we might, in the case of rainfall, be able to say, well, that was caused by the rain. But lots of things in cities aren't caused by particular events. They're caused because people change behavior, or there's been a subtle unintended consequence of an intervention that we hadn't thought about when we designed something. So we have to work in conjunction with many other disciplines. Data and technology is only part of the picture. It's by no means the complete picture. So I was going to finish off here just presenting very briefly a couple of little case studies, just to try and give some meat to what I've been talking about here. And the first one here is around pedestrianisation. So this is Blackett Street, which many of you will know is the main east-west bus route through Newcastle city centre. You can see the monument in the picture there. The city, Newcastle City Council, has for a number of years had a policy to pedestrianise Blackett Street and other parts of the city centre. So that's their policy goal, and it's a long-term policy goal to pedestrianise it. Now, the thing is about cities is that when you introduce a change, because the impacts of that are unknown, it's very easy for people to say, oh, if you do that, that's going to have a terrible effect on my business, journey times, people being able to get on buses. It's going to really impact negatively things. And then it becomes a thing about who shouts the loudest in the city. So whenever a change is introduced, there's an upswell of change is bad, and all change is bad, and it will have negative consequences. So there's lots of opposition to the idea of pedestrianisation. In this case, particularly from some of the bus companies, because it's and taxi firms, because it's an east-west corridor cutting through the city centre. So what we did in Blackett Street is we've been monitoring and observing Blackett Street and the environs around Blackett Street for a number of years. And we've run mini experiments in there. You might remember in the Great Exhibition of the North, every weekend we closed the Blackett Street to through traffic, and they set up these artificial turf and benches and those sorts of things. So we ran these mini experiments in the city, all the time having collected the data from beforehand, collected during, and collected afterwards. Collected data like pedestrian counts and dwell times, how many people were there, how long they stayed, and how that changed when it became pedestrianised. But also things like bus journey times and air quality, Did the air quality improve because the buses were no longer running down that street? Did it become a nicer place to be? And if it did improve, the buses are still running, so did it make it worse elsewhere? So what we were able to provide to the city council is a comprehensive set of data to put numbers against some of these questions. So rather than it being a complete unknown, the city understands that, yes, if you close Blackett Street, that's going to have a negative effect on bus journey times. But on average, the ones that were affected increased by 2%. So that was only adding 25 seconds to the journey. And we improved air quality on Blackett Street, but air quality got a little bit worse on some of the surrounding streets. And when we closed the streets, what we saw is an increase in pedestrian numbers, not a decrease. It didn't have a negative impact on the retail sector. It had a positive impact on the retail sector. And I think this is where smart city data has a real place to play. Perhaps not with creating policy, but supporting hard decisions and bold decisions, because we can provide data and evidence to decision makers to make some of these hard decisions we need in cities to combat climate change, to meet net zero, reduce our carbon, improve air quality, and make our cities a better place. So I think that's a key point here. Providing the evidence emboldens better decisions and makes our stakeholders and our politicians, gives them the ammunition to make these bold decisions that are needed in cities. Second case study here is around urban flooding. Some of you may, this again is the Quayside, and this was what's called the Toon Monsoon in 2012, and we had 3 supercells over Newcastle, and it closed all the roads, it closed the railway, it closed the metro, we lost electricity, people were stranded in their cars, ambulances couldn't get out, fire engines couldn't move, complete shutdown of the city really caused by heavy rainfall. This is actually the dog leap stairs you can see there, not a waterfall. It's normally a stairway, but there was so much water pouring down the hillside. What we've been trying to do with this data is think about how we can use this data to observe at many different scales and then plug that into models and improve those models, and then provide early warning and to our decision makers and the services that need those. So if these sorts of things happen again, when we can deploy our services before it happens, and trying to think how we integrate observations and models to enable these sorts of decisions. So the basic idea is we have things like a rain radar. There's a rain radar on top of one of the university buildings, which scans every couple of minutes, 106 kilometer swathe, and it basically measures how much water is in the sky. So we have this, it's called an X-band rain radar, usually run by the Met Office, but we have our own one here. And that gives us early warning that something is happening potentially. And then we have finer scales of modeling. We have a network of rain gauges around and weather stations around the city. So we can see whether the radar that predicts the rainfall is actually falling and at what intensity and how much rain is falling. We can feed that into real-time, high-resolution flood models that take into account things like the drainage system, the height of your curb, walls and buildings, and produce very, very high-resolution flood models to understand where it's likely to flood given the intensity of the events that we're seeing. And from that, and because of our observations of traffic data and the impacts of these on our transport systems, we can predict the impact of that event. So we know where it's going to flood and we know the impact of that. So we can start to think about the mitigation. Or in the case, if you were a city council, you could perhaps deploy your fire engines, move them out of their stations so they're in position before disaster strikes, if you like. So this is the idea that we combine the observations that we get from smart cities with these new types of models that this data provides the inputs for, but also provides the means of saying, are models any good? A model is just a mathematical guess as what's going to happen. And because it's an estimate, it's always good to be able to validate that model. And through observing and through these smart city systems, we can understand them. So this is an example of a rain radar image. Again, these are all open, and you can download all of these images from the Urban Observatory website. These and other observations are then used to trigger flood modeling using high performance computing, because flooding is a very complex thing to predict. And then we can use our information that we've gathered of traffic networks to understand the impacts of those, the impacts of poor weather and rainfall on things like traffic speed and then queuing and those types of things. So it's through this combination of measurements and modeling that we can build these systems that enable cities to be nicer places to live. So a few takeaways are really about data's just one part of the equation, and smart cities are definitely not a done deal. We are still in the early stages of smart cities. But I do think data has a substantial role to play in a sustainable future for our citizens, because we can understand the unintended consequences. We can empower decision makers to address some of these wicked problems. And Newcastle is the exemplar of how we might do this in an open and transparent way, rather than it being the Googles or the Microsofts who are controlling our data. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to answer some questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Phil. That was really fascinating. I particularly like the idea of wicked problems. I think that's that's just brilliant. Thank you. There are some comments, about how fascinating that was. And I'm sure there'll be a few more come through as people sort of start now typing. There's a few questions that have come through. I've pasted them back into the chat because originally they were just shared with me. So we've got, is there a plan to develop a digital twin for Newcastle? And is there a cost accessing the data produced? Those are both from Charles Sellers. And then a slightly longer question from Adam Nichols about analysing data. So if you want to have a go at those, please, Phil.
So, a digital twin is essentially a model that's coupled back into a real system. So I think a digital twin of a complex system like a city is a bit pie in the sky. We are part of a digital twin initiative that's being run out of Cambridge University, and there's a lot of government money going into infrastructure digital twins. And we also work with Northumbria Water on digital twins. Our particular role, I think, is again around a digital twin. In order to build a digital twin, you have to really understand the system. How the hell do you understand the system if you haven't measured and observed it very closely? That's my,
Yeah.
and so this, in order to build a twin, you first need a load of data. You know, when Rolls-Royce built a digital twin of its engines, the way it did that is it blew up lots and lots of engines and got all of this data about the parameters at which they work. Now, we can't blow up cities to understand them, but we can observe them through these types of networks. So if there's any chance of us building a digital twin that's any use whatsoever, it needs this type of data as a starting point to feed into it, to start to build those models. And if we do build a digital twin, I would want to say, does it actually accurately predict the system that it's trying to twin? And the only way we can do that is through, again, observations to understand the outputs of these sorts of models.
Okay, great, thank you.
Is there a cost in assessing data produced? No, it's all free. Everything's open, everything's free, warts and all. And there are warts because data collection is never perfect. So, I mean, I think that's one of the challenges as geographers and scientists is there is an assumption that if you get a number with 7 decimal places, then somehow that number's been perfected and is a true and accurate reflection of reality. And actually, sometimes the number has a huge amount of uncertainty associated with a measurement. So the idea of being able to think about how we deal with things statistically, so we don't take a single measurement, we think about collections of measurements to try and remove any of this bias and outliers, is a really important concept here. Yeah. But no, there's no cost.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Adam Nichols, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Phil James your question?
Hi Phil, thanks very much. I think in a sense you've addressed some of the things that I was thinking about there, which is you're collecting huge amounts of data, different data, and you need all that data plus other stuff that you haven't collected probably in order to be able to model how cities function. Yeah, but what influences what you've decided to measure and collect, and also what influences what you analyze and how you analyze it?
Well, I'll give you the answer, and then I'll give you the real answer. So the answer is, so we approached it in 2 ways. One of which is around what I call the scientific challenges, is like, which you can summarize by saying, how the hell do you build a smart city? Yeah. So, you know, just how do you do it? You know, how do you manage all of that data? What systems do you use? How do you transmit the data back? How do you arrange it so you can go and climb up lampposts and strap things to them? You know, all of that sort of stuff, the nuts and bolts, the engineering, I'm interested in. And there's really scientific questions around how dense a network do you need? And the way we've approached that is we've said, well, let's build the densest one we can, and then we can always take things away and still see whether we still get the same answer. You can't have a sparse network and then wonder what would have if you can't suddenly make it less sparse. Whereas if you have a very dense network, you can start to make it less sparse. So, and then the rest of it is around challenges. So that's working with the research community, working with citizens groups, working with the local authority around the challenges that they face. So, you know, obviously there's been a big push around air quality because we were in all of the congestion charge and reducing NO2 in Newcastle. So that's been a big one. But, you know, there's lots of little projects associated with those. I mean, I think the challenges that our cities face are pretty straightforward. I don't think the policies, you know, we signed up for a climate emergency. We have a policy around carbon net zero. We've committed to improving air quality. These things are all happening. What we're trying to do is think about how we might have these as better experiments, because, you know, one of the things we don't do is learn from our interventions in cities. We don't learn what worked, and critically, we don't learn what failed. And given sparse resources, if we are to meet some of these challenges around some of these sustainability issues, we have to spend our money wisely.
Absolutely, Phil. Can I follow up a little bit? Yeah, about the objectives of the whole thing. At one point, you said, you know, it's all about making Newcastle and Tyneside nicer place to live. I like that phrase, but we could unpick what nicer means. And if we go back to the comments you made about the A1M, the Western Bypass, you know, all the investment there, and after widening it to 3 lanes and so on, you know, the travel times in the end ended up as the same as the first lot. And, you know, you've got similar things with the M25 around London and, you know, people's travel times around there. And I got an impression that therefore it was a waste of money or something. But actually, the end product is a hell of a lot more drivers or commuters are able to get to work, cross the river and so on in the same amount of time as they were up to tolerance level originally. But I don't know if I'm saying, is that not an improvement? If
your objectives were to move more people,
yeah,
and you know, you can consider it a success. If your objectives were to improve travel times, then but if your objectives were to reduce carbon and to encourage different modes of transport, then it may not have had the effects that you wanted it to.
Yeah.
I mean, the important point is we can quantify, and that's the real key. You know, I mean, I'm not a decision maker. I'm not an elected official. All I'm trying to do is quantify the interventions in as scientific a way as possible. Now, cities aren't labs, and we aren't lab rats, so it's never perfect. But if we can quantify the impacts of our interventions and understand, you know, the cost of that, yes, more people can drive their cars to work at the same time. What's been the cost in terms of air quality? And, you know, and then that has a knock-on effect in terms of health and public health. So it's understanding all of those intricacies and the unforeseen consequences that's what we've been trying to do.
Yeah, thank you. You're muted.
I'm pressing the space bar and it's not working, the technology, you know how it is. There was one other question from Akin. Akin, do you want to unmute and ask, or would you like me to do it? It's written there in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, Phil.
I can, yes.
Great. Building smart cities is lovely and admirable. It starts. Yeah,
well, it's a tricky question, and I don't have any easy answers. You know, urbanization is happening, particularly in the third world, at an incredible rate. And if we are living in cities, then, you know, we have to make the best of it. And I don't think there is an easy answer to urbanization and overpopulation. There isn't easy answers to these things. They are another example of wicked problems. And understanding, again, you know, I'm going to repeat myself, but, you know, that's my job to a certain extent, to have a mantra. If we can quantify the negative and positive impacts, we can make informed evidence-based decisions. And I would rather an evidence-based decision supported through data and analytics. And if smart city, I don't like the term smart cities, but it's a useful shorthand because I don't think they're very smart. They're mostly dumb, but that's another thing. But, you know, I think that's what we're trying to strive for here. And I mean, data isn't the answer, and smart cities aren't the answer to urbanization or overpopulation. It's a terrible answer, but that's because there is no answer to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, some of these things, because they're so new, and like you say, it's all about the insight and analytics and not the data itself. You know, there's so much of the data produced. Yeah, where do you go with some of it? Yeah, brilliant. No, absolutely fascinating, Phil. I think we've come to the end of questions. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to Philip, and absolutely brilliant. You know, so interesting, and to see it in our you know, home region for all of us is so interesting. You know, I can't recommend Urban Observatory enough in lessons and for learners. It gets a bit addictive. That's the problem with Urban Observatory. Once you start, you can't stop. Up on the screen now is our next set of events starting after half term. So please do come and join us for those. And I'm just checking chat one more time in case there's any late questions. I don't see any, Phil, so I'm going to say thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen and